At 60, attention doesn't mean desire. It means you've become useful. And if you don't understand why she noticed you now, you're already behind. Section 1. The moment you become visible again. At some point, something strange happens. You stop being noticed. Not in a dramatic way. No announcement, no goodbye. You just fade into the background. In your 30s and 40s, people saw you for your effort, your work, your role. You were busy, useful, expected. Then time passed. Kids grew up, careers slowed, social circles shrank. One day you realize nobody is really looking at you anymore. You walk through a grocery store and no one makes eye contact. You sit at a cafe and conversations flow around you, not toward you. You're not rejected, you're simply invisible, and that kind of quiet erasure does something to a man. Then, around 60, something changes again. Suddenly people notice you, not the way they did when you were young. This attention feels softer, polite, curious. Someone asks about your routine, your plans, your life. It feels good because it's been a long time since anyone asked. Here's the part most men miss. This new visibility isn't about desire, it's about stability. At this age, attention is rarely accidental. You represent something solid, a paid-off home, a predictable income, a life that's already built. You're no longer judged by potential. You're measured by what's already there. That doesn't mean every smile has an agenda, but it does mean attention now has context. And if you don't recognize that context, you'll misread the moment. When you've gone years without being seen, even neutral interest can feel like attraction. Even basic kindness can feel personal. That's not weakness, that's human. But this is the point where awareness matters, because being visible again doesn't mean you're wanted for who you are. Sometimes it just means you've become easy to find. And if you don't slow down and ask why now, you risk stepping into a story where the attention feels warm, but the reason behind it is cold. Section 2. Why attention after 60 feels complimentary but isn't. When attention shows up later in life, it arrives wearing polite language. No flirting, no bold moves, just calm interest wrapped in nice words. You start hearing things like, "You seem stable," or "I like how grounded you are." Maybe it's "you feel safe," or "you really have your life together." On the surface, those sound like compliments, and after years of being overlooked, they land that way. But listen carefully. None of those words describe attraction. They describe reliability. Attraction is reckless, it's irrational. It's about energy, curiosity, tension. What you're hearing instead are words used to describe structures, foundations, systems that don't move. At 60, you are no longer being assessed for excitement. You're being assessed for dependability. That's not an insult, it's just a shift. The problem starts when men interpret this kind of attention through an old lens. When you mistake appreciation for desire, you give weight to something that was never meant to carry it. Here's why it's confusing. The attention is calm, respectful, and steady. It doesn't feel manipulative, it feels mature. And because it feels mature, men assume it must be sincere. But sincerity and intention are not the same thing. Someone can genuinely enjoy your company and still see you as a solution. Someone can laugh with you, listen to you, and still be running quiet calculations in the background. Those things can exist at the same time. This is where men get caught. They think, "She sees me now." What they don't ask is, what does she see? Is it your personality? Or is it the life you already built? Is she curious about your thoughts? Or about your routines, your security, your predictability? At this stage of life, interest often isn't emotional first, it's practical first. Emotional language comes later. If you don't recognize that order, you'll assume you're being chosen. In reality, you may simply be fitting a requirement, and requirements don't fall in love, they get filled. Section 3. The quiet loneliness that lowers your guard. Loneliness at this stage of life doesn't look the way people imagine it. There's no dramatic sadness, no constant misery. It's quieter than that, more subtle, more dangerous. You're not alone in a room. You're alone in a crowd. You have routines. You function. You wake up, handle your day, take care of what needs to be done. On the outside, everything looks fine, but no one is really checking in. No one is curious about your inner world. Conversations stay surface level and end quickly. Over time, you stop expecting to be noticed. That kind of loneliness doesn't hurt sharply. It dulls you. It makes you grateful for small things. A long conversation, someone remembering your name, someone asking how your day actually went. So when attention finally appears, it doesn't feel suspicious. It feels relieving. That's where the guard comes down. A smile feels bigger than it is. A compliment feels deeper than intended. A little warmth feels like connection. And because you haven't felt it in a while, you don't question it. You accept it. This isn't desperation. It's human response to deprivation. The problem is that loneliness doesn't sharpen judgment. It softens it. You stop asking hard questions because you don't want to disrupt the comfort. You tell yourself it's harmless to enjoy the moment. You tell yourself you deserve this, and you do deserve connection. That's not the issue. The issue is when loneliness makes you rush meaning onto attention, when you assume presence equals care, when you assume interest equals intention. People who understand this dynamic don't need to pressure you. They just need to show up when you're most open, when you're tired of silence, when you're tired of being invisible. That's why timing matters so much. Not because you're weak, but because loneliness changes what feels reasonable. And if you don't account for that, you may give trust where curiosity should come first. Section 4. The financial reality. No one likes to discuss. There's a part of this conversation most people avoid because it feels uncomfortable. It sounds cold. But ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. Money becomes louder with age. In your younger years, finances are abstract. There's time to recover, rebuild, start over. In your 60s, the horizon looks different. What you have now is likely what you'll live on for the rest of your life. That reality creates pressure, not just for you, but for everyone around you. Many people reach this stage without enough. No long runway, no margin for mistakes. And when fear enters the picture, priorities shift. Romance becomes secondary. Stability becomes urgent. This is where intentions quietly change. Partnership stops being about building together and starts being about survival together. That doesn't mean it's malicious. It means it's practical. And practicality doesn't ask for permission. From the outside, it looks like companionship. From the inside, it's problem solving. When someone is staring down decades of expenses with limited resources, they don't look for sparks. They look for structure, predictability, someone who already solved the problems they couldn't. That's where you come in. You're not exciting in the way a younger man is. You're reassuring. You're steady. You represent continuity. And at this age, continuity feels like safety. The danger isn't that someone wants security. The danger is when that security already belongs to you. If you mistake financial alignment for emotional alignment, you step into a role you didn't audition for. You stop being a person and start being a plan. And plans don't require deep affection. They require cooperation. Understanding this doesn't mean assuming bad intent. It means recognizing incentives, because incentives drive behavior far more reliably than feelings. If you don't acknowledge the financial reality shaping late-life relationships, you'll keep interpreting decisions emotionally that were made mathematically. And math doesn't care how kind the delivery feels. Section 5. Why you specifically become the target. This isn't random, and it isn't bad luck. There are reasons why men like you draw attention later in life, while others don't. First, you already did the hard part. You built something, a home, savings, a routine that works. You're not scrambling, you're not unstable. That alone separates you from most people at this stage. Second, you're grateful. After years of being overlooked, attention feels earned. It feels like a reward for surviving, for staying upright when life knocked you around. That gratitude softens your boundaries without you noticing. Third, you come from a different time. You were raised to assume good faith, to believe people mean what they say, to give the benefit of the doubt. That's not weakness, it's character. But it also makes you easier to misread situations where incentives matter. Fourth, you're predictable. That sounds boring, but it's valuable. Your habits are set, your income is steady, your life doesn't swing wildly. To someone seeking security, predictability is gold. And finally, there's time, not a lot of it. That sounds harsh, but it's part of the calculation whether anyone admits it or not. You don't need decades of passion, you need years of peace, and someone else may need years of coverage. None of this makes you foolish, it makes you positioned. The problem starts when you think attention proves desire. At this stage, attention often proves opportunity. You're not being chased for potential, you're being evaluated for usefulness. That's why it feels different than when you were younger. There's less intensity, more reassurance, less curiosity, more confirmation. If you don't recognize why you're appealing now, you'll assume it's about who you are. Often it's about what you already have. And the moment you understand that distinction, you stop reacting emotionally and start seeing the situation clearly. Section 6. The difference between companionship and access. This is where most men get confused, because companionship and access can look identical on the surface. Someone listens to you, shares meals with you, shows concern for your day, remembers details about your life. All of that feels like connection. And sometimes it is, but there's a difference between wanting your presence and wanting proximity to your life. Companionship is about sharing time. Access is about sharing infrastructure. A woman who wants companionship is interested in you, even when nothing is offered. She's comfortable with distance. She doesn't rush integration. She doesn't need immediate reassurance about the future. A woman who wants access is focused on alignment, where you live, how things would work if something happened. She frames it as practicality, as planning, as being realistic. And that's why it's hard to spot, because nothing feels aggressive, nothing feels dishonest. It all sounds reasonable. The confusion deepens because access doesn't require manipulation. Someone can enjoy you genuinely while still wanting what comes with you. Those motives don't cancel each other out. That's the trap. Men think, she treats me well, so her intentions must be clean. But behavior alone doesn't reveal motive, direction does. Watch where conversations drift. Do they circle back to logistics, to shared space, to future arrangements that benefit stability more than intimacy? Companionship grows slowly. Access accelerates. Another difference is pressure. Companionship doesn't rush commitment, it respects pace. Access pushes for clarity early. It needs assurance. It needs definition. When you're valued for access, your boundaries feel inconvenient. When you're valued for companionship, your boundaries are respected. This distinction matters because once access is granted, it's difficult to undo. Emotional bonds deepen. Paperwork appears. Expectations shift. By the time confusion turns into clarity, the cost of stepping back feels high. That's why awareness has to come early, not after emotions are invested, not after lives are blended. Understanding this difference doesn't make you cold, it makes you precise. And at this stage of life, precision protects peace. Section 7. Early signals that should make you slow down. Not every warning sign is dramatic. Most of them are quiet, reasonable, easy to dismiss if you want things to go well. One of the earliest signals is how quickly the conversation turns practical, not emotional, practical. Questions about your living situation, your routine, your plans for later years. On their own, these seem harmless. Together, they form a pattern. Another signal is urgency disguised as efficiency. Statements like, "At our age, we shouldn't waste time," or "We both know what we want now." That sounds mature, but maturity doesn't rush comfort. Pressure always has a purpose. Pay attention to how often the future comes up compared to the present. Are you still learning about each other, or already discussing arrangements? Companionship enjoys the now. Access is focused on what comes next. Watch how boundaries are handled. When you say you want to take things slowly, is that respected or subtly challenged? Do you hear phrases like, "I just don't want to feel insecure," or "I need to know where this is going"? Emotional framing can still be leverage. Another quiet signal is selective curiosity, strong interest in your stability, minimal interest in your inner life. If conversations revolve around structure but skim over substance, something is off. Also notice timing. Attention that appears right after loss, illness, or major life change deserves patience. Vulnerability invites connection, but it also attracts opportunity. None of these signals alone prove anything. The danger is ignoring them collectively. Men get into trouble not because they miss red flags, but because they explain them away. They assume caution means fear. They assume boundaries mean resistance to happiness. Slowing down isn't rejection, it's observation. You don't need to accuse, you don't need to confront, you just need to pause and watch what happens when progress isn't guaranteed. People who want access struggle with uncertainty. People who want companionship can sit in it comfortably. That difference reveals itself only when you stop moving forward automatically. And at this stage of life, automatic decisions are the most expensive ones you can make. Section 8. How men lose everything without ever divorcing. Most men think the real danger is divorce, lawyers, courts, splitting assets. That's what everyone warns you about. But later in life, divorce isn't the biggest risk. Survival is. When two people stay together until the end, there's no courtroom, no fight, no negotiation. There's just paperwork quietly doing what it was designed to do. That's where men get blindsided. At some point, practical conversations start appearing. Beneficiaries, emergency access, just in case, arrangements. Nothing feels dramatic. In fact, it feels responsible, caring, forward-thinking. You tell yourself this is what commitment looks like at this age. But commitment and control are not the same thing. Once names are added, accounts are linked, or documents are adjusted, the outcome no longer depends on feelings. It depends on sequence, who is still standing when everything transfers, and that transfer happens automatically. There's no review of intent, no consideration of who built what, no pause to ask whether this was fair. The system doesn't care about context. It only follows instructions. That's why good intentions offer no protection here. You can be loved. You can be treated kindly. You can be genuinely happy, and still leave behind a result you never would have agreed to if you'd seen it clearly. That's what makes this so dangerous. Nothing feels wrong while it's happening. There's no betrayal moment, no argument, just small, reasonable decisions stacking up over time. Men often realize this too late because they're looking for conflict. They assume harm requires hostility. It doesn't. All it requires is patience, access, and time. By the time reality becomes obvious, undoing it feels impossible. Not because it is, but because the emotional cost of stepping back feels heavier than the financial risk. That's how men lose control without ever being divorced. Not through force, through comfort. And comfort, when unexamined, is the most effective way to disarm a man who's spent his life being responsible. Section 9. Why good men ignore what they feel. By this point, most men sense something. A small hesitation, a quiet discomfort they can't fully explain. But instead of listening to it, they override it. Good men are trained to doubt themselves. You've spent your life being told to be fair, to not assume the worst, to give people a chance. You don't want to be cynical. You don't want to become the kind of man who sees threats everywhere. So when something feels off, you look for a reasonable explanation. You tell yourself you're overthinking. You remind yourself that not everyone has bad intentions. You focus on how kind she's been, not on what's being asked. There's also guilt involved. You think, maybe I'm being selfish, or I've had more than most people. You don't want to seem cold for protecting what you worked for. That guilt is powerful. It makes you soften boundaries you would otherwise keep. Another reason men ignore their instincts is hope. Hope that this connection is real. Hope that this chapter will be easier. Hope that companionship will fill the quiet spaces without costing too much. Hope doesn't blind you instantly. It just delays questions. And then there's pride. Admitting you might be valued for what you provide instead of who you are is uncomfortable. It feels diminishing. So it's easier to believe a better story. The truth is, instincts don't speak loudly, they whisper. They show up as hesitation, not certainty. And if you've spent decades pushing through discomfort to do what's expected, you've learned to ignore whispers. But those instincts didn't appear randomly. They're built from experience, from patterns you've seen before, from moments where things didn't add up. Ignoring them doesn't make you kind, it makes you vulnerable. Wisdom at this age isn't about being suspicious of everyone. It's about respecting your internal signals enough to pause. You don't need proof to slow down. You don't need permission to protect yourself. If something feels misaligned, it usually is. And learning to trust that again is not regression. It's maturity, finally being used for your benefit. Section 10. How to stay open without being used. Protecting yourself doesn't mean closing off. It means changing how you move. The first shift is pace. Time is the most honest filter you have. When things move slowly, real intentions surface. When someone is comfortable with patience, they're not operating on a deadline. Urgency usually means there's something to secure. You don't need to rush closeness to prove sincerity. Closeness that's real doesn't need proof. The second shift is separation. Keep your life intact. Your home, your finances, your routines. Independence isn't distance, it's stability. When someone respects that, it tells you they value you, not just access to your world. Notice how they respond when integration is delayed. Calm acceptance is a good sign. Frustration framed as insecurity is not. The third shift is transparency in both directions. If questions about your stability are fair, questions about theirs are too. You're not interrogating, you're aligning realities. Someone who has their own footing won't feel threatened by honest discussion. Another important shift is perspective. Companionship should reduce pressure, not add to it. If you feel like you're managing expectations, timelines, or emotional reassurance early on, that's information. Peace is a signal, so is tension. You also don't need to justify your boundaries. Explanations invite negotiation. Boundaries don't require debate. I'm comfortable taking this slowly is complete as it is. And finally, keep your world populated. Friends, family, interests. A full life makes you harder to isolate and easier to ground. It also gives others context about who you are beyond what you provide. Staying open means allowing connection to grow naturally, not accelerating it out of fear. You're not behind. You're not late. You're exactly where you are. At this stage of life, the goal isn't to merge lives quickly, it's to see clearly. When clarity leads, warmth follows safely, and safety, not intensity, is what makes connection sustainable now. Section 11. What real connection actually looks like at this age. Real connection later in life is quieter than most people expect. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush to define itself. It doesn't ask for guarantees early on. It feels calm. There's no pressure to impress. No need to secure a future quickly. You spend time together because you enjoy the time, not because you're trying to lock something in. Real connection respects independence. Both lives remain whole, No one feels the need to take over space, routines, or decisions. Togetherness becomes an addition, not a replacement. Conversations are balanced. There's curiosity about how you think, not just how you live. Your past is listened to without being mined for information. Your future isn't treated like a resource that needs planning permission. There's also emotional patience. Disagreements don't turn into leverage. Boundaries don't trigger insecurity. You're allowed to say not yet without it becoming a problem to solve. Another key difference is energy. Real connection doesn't drain you. It doesn't create a low-level anxiety about expectations. When you leave, you don't feel relief. You feel steady. Importantly, real connection doesn't isolate you. It fits into your existing life, instead of slowly replacing it. Family, friends, and routines remain intact. Nothing needs to be pushed aside to make room. There's no sense of being managed or guided toward decisions. No subtle steering. No repeated conversations about what makes sense financially or practically. Instead, there's acceptance of uncertainty, a comfort with letting things unfold at their own pace, a willingness to let time do the work. At this stage of life, real connection values peace more than possession. It doesn't need ownership to feel secure. That's how you recognize it. Not by intensity, not by promises, but by the absence of pressure. If being with someone makes your life feel simpler instead of heavier, clearer instead of tighter, that's your signal. Because real connection doesn't ask you to trade safety for companionship. It allows both to exist at the same time. Section 12. The truth. Most men realize too late. Here's the truth. Most men don't fully understand until it's behind them. Peace is fragile. You spend decades building stability, not just financially, but mentally. You learn what drains you, what disrupts your sleep, what complicates your days. By 60, you're no longer chasing excitement. You're protecting equilibrium. That's why the cost of getting this wrong is so high. It's not just money. It's the slow erosion of control. Decisions that no longer feel like yours. Adjustments you didn't plan to make. Obligations that quietly appear and never leave. Most men don't lose everything in one moment. They lose it in small concessions. Each one feels reasonable. Each one feels harmless. Until the accumulation becomes permanent. Looking back, men often say the same thing. I knew something felt off. Not dramatically, just a sense that things were moving in a direction they hadn't chosen. But they ignored it because everything felt calm, comfortable, easy. Comfort can be deceptive. It lowers resistance. It convinces you that vigilance is unnecessary, that you can relax now. The hard truth is this: no one will protect what you built better than you will. That doesn't mean assuming bad intent. It means respecting your own effort enough to be careful with who you let close to it. You're not obligated to fix someone else's future. You're not responsible for balancing someone else's past decisions. Compassion doesn't require sacrifice of your stability. At this stage of life, wisdom isn't about generosity, it's about discernment. You earned the right to choose peace deliberately, to move slowly, to say no without guilt, to value clarity over comfort. Because once stability is gone, rebuilding it isn't an option anymore. And the men who realize that too late all say the same thing. They wish they had trusted themselves sooner. Section 13. The quiet decision that changes everything. At some point, this all comes down to a single quiet decision. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic ending, just a choice about how you move forward. You decide whether you're going to live reactively or deliberately. Reactive living happens when you let circumstances, attention, or fear of loneliness guide your steps. You respond to what feels good in the moment without asking what it costs later. Most men who lose their peace didn't make a bad choice. They just never made a conscious one. Deliberate living is different. It's slower, calmer. You don't rush to fill space. You don't confuse interest with intention. You don't assume presence equals commitment. You choose clarity over comfort. That doesn't mean rejecting companionship. It means redefining it. Companionship should fit into your life, not reorganize it. It should add warmth without demanding ownership. It should make your days lighter, not narrower. You're not running out of time. That belief is what gets men into trouble. You're running out of tolerance for chaos, for pressure, for situations that don't feel right but look acceptable. And that's not loss, that's progress. By now you know what peace feels like. You know how hard it was to earn. That makes it valuable, not something to gamble with because someone showed interest at the right moment. The most powerful position you can hold at this age is not being needed, it's being chosen freely, without leverage, without urgency, without transactions hiding behind affection. If that kind of connection appears, you'll recognize it. It won't push, it won't rush, it won't require you to give up control to feel close. And if it doesn't appear, you'll still be fine, because your life already works, you built it carefully, You maintained it through difficulty. You protected it when no one else was watching. The final truth is simple. You don't owe anyone access to what you built. And the moment you truly understand that, you stop being vulnerable to pressure and start living from choice. That's not isolation, that's freedom. If this message made you pause, it was meant for you. Subscribe to Psycore for clear, honest conversations men aren't allowed to have anymore. Stay sharp, protect your peace. I'll see you in the next one.